You know, the days of old are just that, days of old. The days where pastor had all the authority and said, this is how it's going to be done, and people jumped to say, right away, whatever you say, pastor. We're in a day where truly those days of what we in the church call hair pasteur have long gone away. But the pastor still does have one little thing that the pastor has control over, and I'm going to take advantage of that today. We're leaving the lectionary, and we're going to talk about something completely different because it's a day for it. So back in seminary, long time ago in a land far, far away, like almost any education process you go through, every professor thinks that their discipline is the most important discipline that you need to learn. If it was a New Testament professor, they said you need to understand how to navigate the Greek and how to exegete the text properly so that you can preach a good gospel sermon. The Old Testament professor would say you need to understand Hebrew and Middle Eastern, Near Eastern culture so that you can navigate how the New Testament and the Old Testament marry together and how Jesus was continuation of the ministry of Israel. The worship professor would say the most important thing you can do is know how to navigate through the liturgy so that people, when they leave on Sunday, know that they have been surrounded by the presence of God. And of course, the preaching professor said the most important thing you need to know is how to preach, because if you can't preach, then everything falls apart. But for me, it was the pastoral care professor that said something to us that, well, probably has carried me through more of ministry than anything else. And it was a simple phrase, Wigiat. I know we've heard it before. Where is God in all this? He said the single most important thing you can do as a pastor is in the highs and lows of life, being able to show people where God is present. The last few weeks have been crazy. The joy and the celebration of the 30th anniversary at Pentecost, confirmation last week with revival and a baptism on Sunday, to a week where the community is hit by a death it has not seen in many years. In the midst of all of that, my son and his fiance's puppy at 2 years old died of cancer at Ohio State on Wednesday morning. It has been a week, y'all. Where is God in all this? Right here. Right where God is supposed to be. You see, we in the Western church, we don't like to talk about what is basically 1/3 of the Bible, lament. We love to talk about praise. We love to talk about how God is with us and how God makes us feel incredible. But about 1/3 of the Bible is about people struggling and suffering and wondering and questioning. 1/3 of the Psalms are lament psalms. Psalms about why are the people being oppressed? Why is there evil in the world? Why are these horrible, terrible things happening? The book of Job is almost all lament, calling out to God in Job's despair. There's an entire book of Lamentations, and if you've read through it in its entirety in one sitting, you are a better person than me. There's Jesus calling out in the garden, Lord, not this. There's got to be another way, but not my will, but yours be done. There are lepers coming to Jesus begging for mercy. There are those coming to Jesus begging for healing and forgiveness. Those are laments. We don't talk about them much in the church because most of us don't walk out of worship feeling good after a day looking at lament, because I don't think we properly understand what lament is. We think that praise and thanksgiving is all this filled with joy, and lament is all this grief and sorrow, and they are opposite. But it's not true. Biblically speaking, praise and lament are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. There is no joy unless you have sorrow to compare it to. There is no thanksgiving unless you have grief to understand it. They are two sides of the same coin. It's the reality of our journey of faith and of the human condition. That understanding of lament. Theologians say that lament is an act of biblical faith. Lament is an act of biblical faith. And lament is a time of grief and sorrow, and yes, dear friends, of doubt. Where is God in all of this? Where were you, God, when this happened to me? Where were you, God, when I called out in my need? Where were you, God, in the darkest time of my life? We know the response that God gives to Job to those questions. Well, Job, where were you when I put the stars in the sky? Where were you when I separated day from night and earth from sea? Where were you, Job? Dear friends, it's okay to lament. It's okay to grieve. It is okay to doubt. I've said it once, I've said it 100 times. The verse that speaks to my soul most clearly in today's world is from Mark 9. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. Despair is the opposite of faith. Doubt is part of faith. When folks come to me and say, Pastor, I hate this, good. But you see, hate's not the opposite of love. Apathy is the opposite of love. I hate this so bad is not a horrible thing. I just don't care anymore. It's something that we don't come back from. Lament is an act of faith. Asking God, where are you, Lord? Crying out to God, where were you, God? Is an act of living out our faith. But you see, most of us haven't been told that or taught that. Because, well, we don't like to talk about our struggles to other people, really, not even to God. When we would do our men's and women's retreat and there'd be time of individual confession and absolution, folks were uncomfortable talking about the brokenness and sin in their own life. Most of the folks that came to talk to us, well, they didn't have much to say because they weren't sure exactly how to define the brokenness in their own spirit. So we don't come to God crying out our frustration, our doubt, our lament. Because somehow we have been taught from an early age that that's not what we do to God. Because God knows everything and is everywhere and is all love. And we don't talk about our grief, our despair, our loneliness, and our brokenness. Because it doesn't make us feel good. It makes us feel like somehow we have failed. We have failed in our journey of faith, in our walk of life, and carrying out our baptismal promises. We feel somehow that we are saying that God isn't who God is. But trust me, or if not me, trust Scripture. Trust thousands of years of human history. Where is God in all this? Exactly where God is supposed to be. In the brokenness of our lives. In the pain that we feel. Yes, even in the doubt that sometimes creeps into our journey of faith. Because you see, that's where God's promised to be. Up on top of the joyous mountain of transfiguration, the place where the disciples say, Lord, it is good for us to be here. We never want to leave. And you know what? Those other 9 guys that we've traveled with for the last couple of years that are down on the bottom of the mountain, to heck with them. They don't got what we got. Let's build some tents. Let's hang out here. This is the place to be. Jesus looks at them and says, no, this is not the place to be. Matter of fact, walk your happy feet back down the mountain and don't tell anybody what you saw up here. In that place of incredible joy, where it seems like that life could not get any better, God says, walk off the mountain. But yet, in the 23rd Psalm, when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we're not to be afraid, for God is with us. God's rod and staff, they give us comfort. In the presence of our enemy, God prepares a picnic, a feast, surrounded by the bulls of Bashan, as it says in Psalm 22. God tells us to pause, to be at peace, to be at rest, because God is with us in those moments. We are not the first in the world that have experienced grief and loss, tragedy and torment. We are not the first people of faith that have cried out to God and maybe even rendered our clothes and covered ourselves in ash and worn sackcloth the way Jesus' people, the Jews, did. But God has always been with us, walking beside us, sometimes dragging us. We all remember the old poem about footprints in the sand, and when there was only one set of prints, Jesus was carrying us. I've never experienced that in my life. Normally it's one set of footprints and one drag mark where Jesus just had to drag me through my own grief. But that's the reality of God's presence with us. God is with us in the midst of our lament, in the midst of our grief, in the midst of our brokenness. God doesn't promise that things will be erased, that the clock will be wound back, that everything will be restored. God says, I will make all things new. And that means you and me. God is with us to give us healing. You know, one of the things that I've heard said on more than one occasion when someone is grieving, and it just makes me kind of cringe, is, well, this is your new normal. Okay, I don't want this. This is not anything that I signed up for, and if this is the new normal, you can keep it. Doesn't mean that it's the new normal, but it is reality. And God's promise is God walks with us in that reality, whatever that reality looks like. In those days of joy and satisfaction, God walks with us. In those days where it takes every bit of our emotional, spiritual, and physical energy to put one foot in front of the other, God walks with us. God walks with us when laughter and joy breaks into our life. And God walks with us when tears come way too easily. God walks with us when we are smiling and playing. And God walks with us when we look at a friend of ours as we're walking down a hall in the hospital and we say, I really just want to put my hand through a wall right now. God walks with us. You see, God has called us out of our own darkness into his incredible light. God has called us out of our own brokenness into his wholeness. God has called us out of our own grief into his peace. God has called us out of our lament into his joy. Now, most of us don't walk in one category or the other. We walk someplace in the middle, not in the great sunshine or the deep darkness, but someplace in those golden hours, just as the sun is setting and the sky is beginning to turn purple, or just in those morning hours when the sun is beginning to rise and it's still just a little hazy and dark outside. Most of us live our lives in that place. Not completely paralyzed by lament, but not completely standing on top of a mountain singing praise to God. If you remember, years and years and years ago, we had a sermon that was something about this, I think we did it on Transfiguration Sunday, and we talked about how God is with us in the valleys and God is with us on the mountain, and quite honestly, those two places are probably the easiest to be. Because when we're in the valley of death, nobody expects or demands anything from us, and we can just be. When we're on top of that mountain of joy and peace, everyone looks to us and goes, I wish I could be like them, and there's peace. But if you remember, I said I come from West Virginia. Being on top of the hill is a nice place to be. Being in the valley is not a bad place to be, but most of us walk with a limp because we walk along the side of the mountain, and that's exhausting. The old joke, how can you tell a West Virginian? It's because one leg is shorter than the other because we've been walking this way our entire life. That's where we walk in our life of faith, y'all. The hard journeys. The journeys where sometimes we feel like we're cutting away more brush than we are taking steps, where we feel like every step we take, we are wrapped in a vine holding us back, walking on the side of the hill where every day our lungs burn and our legs ache. God is with us on the side of the mountain as well. Dear friends, we believe. God helps our unbelief. Where is God in all of this? The same place that God has always been. Not on some heavenly throne, in the far recesses of heaven, but God is in the midst of God's people, knitting us together with peace that passes all understanding, with hope that sustains, with love that consoles, and with those moments, maybe short, maybe spread out too far, but those moments of incredible joy as we remember, as we share, as we get out of our own way and remember that God is God. Lament, dear friends, is an act of faith. And many days, it is the only act of faith that we have the energy to give, is to ask, is to beg, is to question. Where are you, O God? Where are you? And in those moments, in those times that we feel that God is so far away, the promise of Scripture says that God is with us. The rod and staff giving us comfort, spreading the feast for us as we deal with our enemies. Where is God in all this? Look around. Right here. With us. Right now.